it going, folks? I'm Matt. This is Studderz, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Bean, the show where we talk about breeders, about their craft, and who they are. And today we've got an awesome guest, comes highly recommended, Terpfi3rknd. Glad to have you on the show, brother.
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate you having me on.
Now, I will be completely honest. I have never had a chance to grow your genetics. Maybe one day down the road I will, but you, like I said, you come highly recommended by folks that I absolutely trust. So definitely stoked to have you here on the show today. Talk about the craft, talk about who you are, and, we'll get in a little bit about the genetics and that sort of thing. Before we really get into that discussion, I want to kind of talk about who you are, how you got into the game, and a bit about your grow style, man. How do you go about the craft?
So, to be honest with you, man, cannabis is pretty much I always say the only things I was ever really great at were growing weed and talking shit. And luckily for me, I've kind of turned the two into a field of work.
Nice.
I started pretty early, early teens. I picked up the plant. It wasn't too long after that before I realized this was fairly simple thing to grow. And I think we all have that moment where we go, wait, this is way easier than I thought it was,
It's
little
time, little effort.
Right. You hop in and you get your hands dirty, and before you know it, 25 years have gone by, and it's in my blood. I always joke, I'm talking weed with somebody 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it's never a bother when people hit me up and just have general grow questions or any sort of like troubleshoot questions or whatever, we can chat,
I hear you, man.
I'm kind of from the East Coast originally, from West Central Georgia, and kind of growing up on that side, we were kind of self-sufficient. We had to teach ourselves most everything that we needed to know. So from an early age, it was learning hash, it was learning edibles, it was, learning all the little micro facets of what we do and what we love. And through that, I kind of became a jack of all trades of, making hash. I did that commercially for a while. I've done commercial cultivation before for long periods of time. And I kind of landed on genetics because, to be honest with you, there was a weird spot in the market. Price of flower had dropped for just about everybody significantly. And genetics have always been a passion. Hash and extracts are kind of my thing. And they go hand in hand, in a certain way, making new flavors and then extracting new flavors and enjoying new flavors. And that's kind of the passion behind a lot of my work. A lot of it is trichome driven. A lot of it is flavor driven. Terp3nd is not just a clever moniker. I generally love flavors, all flavors. And that's kind of been the crux of my work, has been trying to find unique and different and interesting flavors and then bring those to people in a form where, whether it's extracts, whether it's flower, whatever your thing is, a way that you can enjoy it.
Oh, certainly. And I absolutely appreciate that myself. I'm a big fan of flavor, big fan of effect, and there's so much out there to experiment with, play with, mash together, and that sort of brings me to my next question. How did it start? I mean, you said, okay, I want to start doing genetics, but what was the first go at it? Tell me about that.
Okay, so when I started growing, kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, we were super limited in genetics. So your real options at that point were Mark Emery seeds, go to Amsterdam, go to Canada, or maybe the forums, friends, to just trade through the network.
Right.
And so my earliest seed explorations were literally out of necessity. Were out of not really having availability of other genetics. You get something you like, you find something else you really like, and you just bang them together. Some of my earliest seeds that I had made were just out of necessity. I had two flavors I loved, and I need more of them, and they're not going to be around anymore. When I started to do it full time, I had been doing commercial hash for a while, which I really love, but it had gotten to be a grind in the sense that, like, the moment you have to do it at 5 a.m. is the moment where it's not really fun anymore, and it's like, not that we don't grow weed 24 hours a day, but like when you got to get up and you got to grind hash for 12 hours a day, it really becomes a grind, and people that love it do it. And I didn't love the process as much. And so I kind of got into more genetics, like I said, a little bit out of necessity, just because the market had changed pretty heavily. And some of those early experiments for me before they really became commercially viable experiments, were really just strains that I loved. You know, I have a bad habit of making people smoke more kush than they probably like. So I have a bad habit of infusing strains with different kushes and old world kushes. And just because that's what I love.
Yeah.
I'm an old school banana fan. So any of the heavy myrcene banana strains, I'm a huge fan of. And so that's, I always joke that my goal in the end is just to make people smoke more kush, whether they like it or not. And a lot of my strains tend to have kind of some foot in that ethos of like, you know, really heavy medicinal, heavy indicas. Um, Largely, that's what I find really helpful for, you know, almost whatever you need, unless you're just a person that can't have heavy strains. You know, all those myrcene heavy strains really helped me medicinally in a number of ways. And that's something that I've kind of, uh, in being a breeder, you kind of have to be an everyman, right? You have to make one seed that's going to grow in a million different environments with a million different growers, and that seed has to be perfect for everybody. And it's a lofty expectation of a breeder, but it's what we expect as
Yeah.
growers. It's what we expect. We want seeds to be perfect. We want the work to be done. We want all the legwork to be done. We want it to be easy, and we want it to be cheap. And rarely is cheap easy, and rarely is easy cheap. You know, I
Oh
mean,
yeah. But
there's
hey,
just it's
good fast cheap pick too, right?
right. And it's there's just a little bit of like, as we approach genetics in any context going forward, we all have to remember that we look for what we love. And that's what, as a breeder, whether it's a grower, that's what you should look for, and what you should be passionate about is what's that thing that you think there should be more of. And if you go out and you try to put more of that into the world, you will guarantee that when we get to the next generation, that thing that you love will still be here somewhere.
That's really cool, man. That's a great philosophy and a great way to approach it. So as you approach the process of making a selection, putting two plants together, tell me about that. How do you work it out? You found two plants that you like, and you said, "Geez, these could go well together."
The short answer is it's just you just do it. The
Yeah.
short answer is to do it. But that's if I just have two plants. I already know the two plants that I love, and I don't really have much of a goal other than I just want these two plants to make babies, right? The short answer is you do it, you run those seeds, and you see what's there. That's going to tell you more than your eyes. That's going to tell you more than your nose. It's going to tell you more than anything else is being able to do it. But as we go into those decisions, there's a couple things that those of us that have done it for a little while, you develop an eye for certain things, right? So for me, I want plants that can finish under a certain height, right? My biggest thing is vigor and being able to adapt to anybody's garden. So, like I said, if I give you a seed, I don't know if you're growing in a tent. I don't know if you're growing in a 100,000 square foot warehouse. I have to give you a seed that's going to grow anywhere. It's going to grow well. So the first eye for me, anything that's finicky, anything that just doesn't produce well, anything that grows kind of runtish or doesn't have, it's gone. Right? That's the first lick is at vigor. The second thing that I almost always look for is resin production and flavor. And those two kind of go hand in hand. Big trichomes produce more oil. Big trichomes are what the hash makers want. Easy breakability from the trichome stalk and things like that is generally what most people at hash makers are looking for. And so I tend to go backwards. I tend to say, well, if it makes great hash, it's almost always going to smoke well, right? It
Fair.
doesn't work the other way. Just because it's a great smoking strain doesn't mean you're going to throw it in the wash and you're going to pull
So
a
much
bunch of
truth.
hash off of it,
Yeah, I
right?
hear you.
And so that's kind of one of those fine things that like resin is important, but bud structure is also important. So if we only have tiny little dime sized bud, it doesn't matter how much resin's there. It's only so much bud for the resin to sit on. And so, there's a balance of finding strains that produce well for the flower crowd and for the hash crowd, but also kind of keeping those flavor profiles and the unique stuff and, the little nuance that everybody's looking for, right? But a lot of it is eye. A lot of it is technique. A lot of it is having looked at tens, if not hundreds of thousands of plants, and just kind of being real discerning in. I'm not going to put up with it if when people ask me, I just got one of your packs. What do I need to do? You should be able to take that and grow it in any garden that you have And from if I did my job, you should be able to grow dank weed that impresses your friends, right? Doesn't matter what your skill level is, doesn't matter what your knowledge base is. You should be able to take a top quality seed and grow dank weed and show your friends and impress them. If I did my job, then that will happen for every person that runs my seeds. I like to think I hit more home runs than I do misses, man. And that's, I think, for in this day and age, the hallmark of a good breeder is just happy customers, happy customer service, people that want to come back, and people that want to tell their friends. That's the big thing. We live in a social media world, but you're still so tied to people. That my friend, I heard it from a friend. My friend told me you got the good
Oh,
stuff.
huge.
That's how weed still works.
Yep.
Guy with the good stuff, you heard about a friend. That's just how it goes, right?
I mean, so much so. And I've said that before in my community and whatnot, that like some of the best stuff I've gotten is stuff that I've received a recommendation from something or someone that I trust.
Right.
So then let's get into talking about what you would consider some of your signature strains, your best work, stuff that you're most happy with. What should we be looking for?
So I would say that the three strains that I've probably produced that have brought me the most relief, but that I think have also resonated really well with other people. And it kind of covers a couple different bases. The Nag Champa is probably number one. It's a really unique incense heavy profile, but to short it like that is really doing it a disservice. Plant to plant, everyone is going to have a super unique characteristic, whether it's citrus, whether it's roses, whether it's incense. So it's for me, it's become one of the most versatile. It kind of goes back to the mother, which was a pineapple sorbet from Aficionado Seeds.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most complex strains I've ever smoked, I've ever worked with. Changed my idea of flavor the minute I ran into it.
Oh, wow.
And it's one of those that if I could have, I should have just banged everything to that for 20 years and I could have won the game. It's one of those that it's super candy, but it's like everything it touches has this depth and complexity that where when you're hitting it, whether it's hash, whether it's, really good, well-grown weed, there's always that nuance that makes you go, man, let me get that one more time. There was something there I couldn't just put my finger on, right? When you can describe a strain really easily as like, it's kind of lemon or it's just gas or, those are the strains we easily forget. Like those at the end of the day aren't really the strains that we're like, you know what, man, I had this thing and you're not going to believe it. That's the one where you just can't ever put your finger quite on it. It's always this thing that's just out of reach, but it's so unique that
Oh,
you're
I
like,
know it.
just
Yeah,
one more, man.
I hear you. You just can't stop going back to that bag or that jar because it's just that's got that draw, that attraction, that something different, man. Oh, I appreciate
So the
that.
next one for me would definitely be the blackout truffle.
Okay.
That's the medicine. When people call me and they're like, I have severe pain, I have something that I just everything else hasn't really worked for me. I tell them the blackout truffle. It's a biochem white cherry truffle. And the biochem is just everything old school you ever loved. It's a Sensi Star Chem 4, which it, it's all of the best of the chem line with none of the headaches. It's short flowering. It's got all of that like stinky foot old school funk to it, but it doesn't have that like 11 weeks and still pushing out pistils. It doesn't have some of the tall, lanky, doesn't have all the kind of weird herm problems. Like it's just got all of the best of the chems and it's got that like just funk that knocks you out. And then I'd have to say number 3 lately has been the Ego Death, which
Okay.
is a blackout truffle cross. And I really hate to say that, but it's become like it's the jar I can't keep in front of me fast. And like, I have to put it outside of my reach because if it's right here,
Yeah,
it's gonna be what's going in
I
next.
feel
And
that.
it's this even blend of like skunk, gas, and chem. And it's just don't break it up in the car. Like don't break it up in the car because somebody's gonna think somebody's shit in the car. It's just that old school funk. But it's just absolute resin. It took the blackout truffle just a higher notch with the resin. It's one of those that's just an absolute dumper in the bags. But yeah, I mean, I'd say as far as lately, those have been the three that I think have really stood, kind of come up, and more often, they're the ones that people hit me up and are like, where do I get this one?
Yeah, buddy. Those sound fantastic. You've said one of my favorite words several times, hash. Let's talk hash for a minute. That's oh, I can talk hash for hours. Shout out to my boy Hash Rookie, also known as Woody Wilson,
Wait,
for
wait,
making
wait,
the
wait,
connection.
wait. Shout out to Hash Rookie.
Absolutely,
Gotta give the shout outs to Hash Rookie.
100%.
Hash Rookie took my hash. This is man, I've 20 years I've been making hash. And I was never really a big Sift guy for a long time, but kind of out of necessity at a point in my life, Sift became my thing. Hash Rookie took my game from rookie level to like intermediate level with just a couple of tips. And I'm gonna be honest, man, it changed a lot of things for my hash game. So absolute shout outs to Hash Rookie.
He's a stellar guy, and that's the thing. He's one of those folks who continues to push the envelope. And I ask him, what's your goal? He says, just make better hash. Well, after you've done that, what are you gonna do? Make it even better. So,
That's it,
okay,
man.
pursuit of
That's it.
excellence. Appreciate
Yeah,
that.
that's it. And that's that thing, man, that when you get involved with weed people, you'll find a lot of them are very obsessive in that way of like, just because it impresses you doesn't mean it's going to impress somebody else. And knowing that there's always a level that's a little bit better, and there's always that little bit that you could have done better. That's the thing that pushes weed people to that like obsessive point,
Oh,
because a
absolutely.
lot of us have that thing. And especially when you get into hash, because growing and cultivation and weed is one level, but once you get into the hash game, it's a next step. It very much is like another level of dedication, passion, cleanliness. And it's really one of those things it's one of the most awesome parts of cannabis in general is
I
the
couldn't
hash.
agree more. Yeah, no, pulling together good extracts, it's in itself is such a rewarding process, especially when everything comes together. So I mean, you just kind of touched on sift, more in the dry sift, you like the
Oh,
bubble hash. What's
okay.
what's the best way to go
So
about it?
I won the first ever trophy for rosin with the hair straightener and with a good friend. And it was one of those that um the having watched the industry change from 2014 to 2018, even, I mean, just that a couple of year window, having watched the explosion of live resin, having watched the explosion of rosin, having really watched the melt game take to another level, watching BHO just explode in ways we had never seen. America went from a country that imported all of its hash. There was a time in this country where if you consumed hash, it came from somewhere
Yep,
else,
yeah, absolutely.
almost all of it.
Yep.
To now, America has its own homebred hash culture. It's every soccer mom with a hash pen. It's every dorm room with a dab rig. Whether people understand it's hash or not, hash has exploded in ways in this country that are amazing. So I am a fan of all great hash. It really doesn't matter how it's made, if it's as long as it's made with that obsessive quality I'm all about all of it. But I generally prefer high-end live BHO extracts, whether it be
Okay.
high terpene extracts or just really terpy sugars and stuff like that, and probably rosin. Or man, I'm the picky guy that says there's probably only a handful of 6-star melt strains out there in on the whole planet. There's a lot of 5-star. There's really not a ton at that top, absolute top level of
Yep.
melt. Um, Past that, man, to the entirety of the rosin industry and how that went from people in their rooms, dorm rooms, or in their homes with hair straighteners, to now multi-ton heated presses and just all of the cool things that have exploded in that industry. It's awesome because so much of that happened in the States of just people going to cups, people showing their jars off, people having getting humbled. Like one of the most humbling things is to take what you think is the dankest hash to a cup and realize you had mids.
No.
I think it's happened to all of
Yeah.
us, man, because if you've been in hash production long enough, you've had that thing where you were like, man, this is the one. And then you just see something else that makes you put your hash back in your pocket. You don't even want to pull it out. And it's happened, man. And that's that thing that you go back and you go, that's not going to happen again. I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to go pop 10,000 seeds till I find that one that changes my life, and that's the competition, man. That's that thing,
Oh yeah.
the pursuit that, man, it gets you so stoked to go back and then realize like I got to start back over, but now there's a whole new level that I get to go to.
And I think that's really the best part about it, because you work hard at you get on top of your game, you're making your production, you're doing what you think are the great next steps. I've got great product. It's fantastic. And then somebody like my boy Studderz sends me a little jar of his product, and well, here's a whole new bar that I have to achieve. Absolutely fantastic, and just seeing how some of these guys are really pushing the envelope, making the changes, and producing product, on the next level, and then helping elevate and bring the rest of us up to that level. So when we talk about hash, when we talk about your strains, what are you doing for breeding for hash? How are you ensuring you've got good dumpers? Are you getting in there with the scope and looking at trichome head? Or are you producing something that's, oh, this one was really excellent, sticky, really stuck to my fingers? What about that?
I mean, obviously all of that's important throughout the process, but to be honest with you, when I started breeding, and this is kind of, I get a lot of like, hey man, I'm getting into breeding, like what are your tips, what can you help me out with? The best thing I can tell you is start with great strains.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody starts somewhere, and a lot of people are embarrassed to use other breeders' gear, but the reality is that when you start out as a breeder, you're going to have to use somebody else's work. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's, something you're going to a field and picking. You didn't do that work. Like, even if you picked it out of, if somebody did that for years and years and years, kept those plants there, everybody's borrowing somebody's work. Just make sure when you start, whoever's work you start working with is solid, because those are the building blocks of the rest of your program.
Yep.
When I started out, I generally worked in hash at the time. Like when I got into breeding full time, I was also working commercial hash at the time. And so a lot of the strains that I started working with were strains that I would see in the lab that would perform well. So
Right.
we'd have a great way. I'm always weird about talking about venues of different places that we worked with, but we were working with a place that had really good Lucky Charms, right?
Okay.
And one of the strains that they would give us produced Lucky Charms that it just dumped and dumped and dumped, and it was great hash, and it performed really well. So later on down the road, when I had a chance to work with, authentic Lucky Charms, I just jumped at so it's really just starting with strains that work well, working with strains that work well. But then a couple of the podcasts we do, I don't know that people are going to love that I talk about this, but like as breeders, there's kind of cheat codes, right? And we've probably all seen it a little bit. There's strains that when you cross something to it, it's going to perform well, right? So when you see stuff cross to Purple Punch, somebody took the cheat code. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing.
No, exactly.
It's not necessarily a pejorative.
Yeah.
It just kind of means you kind of know what it's one of those strains that breeds very well for trichome development.
Yeah.
Right. Slurricane, another great one, beautiful trichomes, not the terpiest strain on the planet, but when you cross it to other terpy stuff, it's a hash winner. It makes great hash. There's strains like that whether it be through the community, your own personal wash lab, just your work, you kind of learn that there's strains that not only make great hash themselves, but pass those traits that we're looking for on, right? So I will say generally it's determined by the bag a lot of times. We're always looking for strains with big heads. Big heads contain more oil. And then you get into like oil wax ratio. So it's like the less wax you have and the more oil, usually the greasier your hash is going to be. But a lot of times those sort of strains don't always held up as well to the water. So there's a fine balance of finding strains with just the right amount of cuticle that you can beat it up in a washing machine or a tumbler or whatever your situation is, and they're not all just going to rupture, but that also will not have so much wax that when you throw that hash into a rosin bag, you lose another 8 to 10% of it,
Right.
because it's all just wax and it's all just stalks and it's all
Lipids and all that.
But
Yeah.
once again, we get into kind of what I mentioned before, that as a breeder, you kind of have to be everything to everybody. You kind of have to be able to think of all of those. You have to understand the plant, you have to understand the customer, you have to understand every person that's going to grow it, and you have to just be willing to hand a seed to somebody who's never grown before and hope they can grow dank. And it's when we start to get into the nuances of trichome development, that's almost entirely a new pursuit. We mentioned on the podcast, another one of my podcasts, that dealing with hermaphrodites in the gene pool is a fairly new problem.
Yeah, we introduced it ourselves.
Cannabis.
Yeah.
It's not something that people have been breeding against for 150 years. It's just not, because it generally doesn't happen outdoors. A lot of times it's a reaction to stress indoors, whether it be lighting, whether it be they don't like, it's a little too intense, they don't like your spectrum, whatever. The plants are finicky, right?
Yeah, reasons.
So even to have acknowledged the hermaphrodite problem is only a couple decades old problem. In the world of cannabis, that's nothing. So some of these things are kind of very modern problems and very modern situations. And as a breeder, our goal is to try and kind of stick to your heart, but also breed what works for you. So like, if I usually figure if it's a strain that impresses me, whether it's a wash strain, a grow strain, if it impresses me, most people are going to be impressed by that. But at the same time, you have to keep looking, because today's wow is going to be out in about 15 minutes. And so you have about that long of people's attention spans to really get in with people and resonate well,
Absolutely. Now, a couple of things that you've talked about, having a non-finicky plant, being able to have stuff that will sort of grow in an environment, to me speaks of testing. How do you guys go about ensuring what you're putting out there is going to be, best quality, not that finicky, chance of hermaphroditism, very low? What's the testing process like?
So the short answer is it's beating plants up, but it's not really just throwing a bunch of plants in one room, beating them all to hell, and then you call it tested.
Yeah.
It is kind of running it in different environments. It's kind of running it in different situations that aren't the way it was grown. Because if I grow a plant in my environment, whatever that may be, and I'm dialed in well, that plant goes through an ideal set of circumstances. It's not really getting what an outdoor grower might do.
No.
Or what a small closet grower who just got started and is using Miracle Grow might do. So it really is just getting stuff and putting it under light stress, putting it under different environments. But at the end of the day, man, it goes back to those genetic selections. If you start with predictable plants, a lot of the times your outcomes are not going to be that wild, right? And now that doesn't mean you're not going to have variation,
No.
but you're usually going to have a set of variables that are somewhat understandable. You're not going to see stuff that's so weird that you go, I don't know what that is or where that came from. So starting with genetics that are somewhat solid, starting with strains that are kind of old school, have been worked through, have been, beaten up themselves, then once you start to introduce some of this newer stuff, your outcomes are a little bit more predictable, in the sense of knowing one of your parents very well is so much better than just having two rando plants that you don't know what's going on, because the variables are so wild from two plants you know nothing about that you'll never be able to predict what you want and what that's going to carry on. But when you're working with a strain that you've worked with for years and years and years, I know what he or she looks like. I know what they're going to bring to the party. So it tells me so much more about my other donor parent, the parent that I'm bringing to the whatever party we're talking about, because I know nothing about that 8 times out of 10. I know something, but I don't, if it's a new strain, I don't know what it's, how it's going to perform, how it's going to look genetically, how it's stature. There's a lot I don't know. Knowing one of those two parents at least is invaluable.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
when we're
So,
getting into
what?
kind of one more thing, when we're getting into a lot of who's who and what's what, knowing your strains is almost just as good as a million testers, because you know what to expect. You know what, the worst you're going to see.
Oh, for sure. And familiarity with the plant is absolutely paramount. And it's always good to grow strain at least a few times to get the feel for it. But what about the boys? I know lots of folks will run the male for 3, 4 weeks, chuck it done. I've got my pollen, I've done my thing. Are you doing anything to push those males, test those out further, really get a feel for the male side of the line?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, man, with males, it's structure.
Yeah.
Um, like I said, I look for kind of less branchy plants. So plants that kind of keep a structure that I'm kind of similar with, and kind of want everything to look like. Flavor, trichome development. How does what is his cross going to look like in the trichome department?
Yeah.
But really, males, you can't really pick up a male and just start using a male. Like a lot of the males that you need to use, especially if you're trying to have a long breeding line, uh, you need to start with something that's predictable, something that is easy to understand, because you don't really get to see him finish. So when you're looking at it, if you're looking at plants that are just throwing tons of branch everywhere, that's pretty much going to be a huge chunk of your structure in all of your crosses, right? We can only tell so much from male flowers, right? We can tell they smell, we can tell how much odor there is, and we can tell their structure. But once you find one that you love, it's one of those things where that's what you're looking for early on, is that male that he does everything you need, he checks the right boxes, he fits the right spot, and you stick with it, and it's one of those tough things, because you have to do so much work. You can't just assume. You have to do the breeding and see what he brings to the table. But yeah, it's males is probably the toughest part of breeding,
Yeah.
finding ones that you love, and then finding ones that produce well.
And I think that's what it is. A lot of guys will search and hunt and find that star male and just cross everything to it. And it brings out a lot of different projects. And of course, as a breeder, you probably have a lot of projects on the go. So I'd like to know about a time when a project that you worked on just absolutely shattered expectations, knocked it out of the park. But at the same time, when it fell off the rails. Talk about the highs, talk about the lows.
Yeah, so the highs are usually easy. I think the big thing that changed in my perspective of genetics was the pineapple sorbet.
Yeah.
Like I said, it was one of those strains that I had run exotic and I had run complex. This was one that just changed a lot for me. And when I hit a lot of stuff to that, man, there's people that have started seed companies off that first batch of seeds. Like they were just that amazing. And really, to no benefit of my own, I mean, to no credit of my own, because I was using other people's gear, but it was just one of those strains that it outperformed the sum of its parts. It
Yeah.
was so much better than anything the two combining could have been. I think the time that things went really bad genetically, that's a tough one. Man, I could tell you this story, and this is one of those weird things as a breeder that you find out at the wrong time. I didn't find out until years into breeding that I was deathly allergic to pollen.
I've
And I'm
heard
not
similar
talking
stories.
about
Yeah.
like I'm not talking about like a little allergic and I get the sneezes. If I breathe a full nose full of pollen, I am done for 5 days.
No
Like
kidding.
my whole face just shuts down. Like it's just, yeah, it's the craziest thing
Wow.
ever. And finding that out after years of walking in rooms full of pollen, I think it was one of those that like you can develop allergies later in life, and especially cannabis pollen specifically is an allergen. So just breathing huge amounts of it, it was, I say now, a predictable outcome. But it definitely was one of those things that I didn't realize until it happened to me. And then after about the third time, I realized, oh, I'm deathly allergic to this whole thing. What an
Yeah.
irony that this is the essence of my job.
How it goes. How it goes.
Respirators, man, listen, man, proper PPE, proper protocols. It's one of those things that we all do it until it bites us in the butt, but it's a very valuable lesson in your grow, in your life. Like, don't step by those things that you know aren't good, man, because it takes one time for you to get bit, and then your whole life changes. Now I can't, literally can't work anywhere around pollen without a full face respirator, like decked out. Yeah, it's wild.
Wow.
But that was one of those that, learned the lesson. It wasn't quite a strain I bred, but it was one of those, and it's just cannabis pollen. I don't have seasonal allergies. I can go out in the worst pollen counts outside,
Yeah.
no problem.
Just
But
something about that cannabis falling.
specifically cannabis pollen, it kills me. Yeah.
Just odd. Just odd. I want to change gears a little bit. I want to talk about collaborations. Anybody that you're working with, any projects coming up, anybody that you'd love to work with that you haven't got a chance?
That's tough, man. Just because I have this weird relationship with other breeders, and I just say weird in that I work with a ton of other breeders' material as well as my own. So I work with, indirectly or directly, a lot of different breeders. I tend to focus almost exclusively on friends, smaller breeders, people I trade with, people that do, not necessarily huge seed houses. There's a couple exceptions to that. I do work with a few kind of bigger breeders that I, absolutely love. And I don't know about collab directly. Like, I've spoke to a couple of people that, I would love to do a collab with Aficionado, just because I've worked with a bunch of their stuff. And, shout out Leo. We've chatted a couple of times. Only because we took their pineapple sorbet. That strain has gone all around the world. I've taken it to F4s at this point. I don't see him work with it a ton, if at all, anymore. So, he's shouted out the project for some years now, and it's gone all the way to Spain and had people work with it there. It's a huge hit in South Africa. Shout out to Jacques and Leapfrog Genetics. Those guys run absolute tons of the pineapple sorbet crosses. And I've talked to them kind of about wanting to, do some sort of a collab down the road. I'd love to, get them to work again with the pineapple sorbet project. They've actually, the French connection aficionado at one point did some work with the F3s from the line that we've been working with. But for me, man, a lot of genetics, I generally prefer to work with breeders who are open to other breeders working with their stuff. This is a weird thing in the industry, that there's people who have very tight egos about who can work with what and what you can and can't use, and this and that and the other. And generally, I'm big on, if you buy a pack of seeds, that pack of seeds belongs to you. Every male, every female, every plant that comes from it, you paid for, and they're yours to use as you choose. We generally work with breeders that have a very similar ethos. I always say I encourage people to use any of my strains for whatever projects you have. I always say the best I could do is hand you a great crayon that you go then make a masterpiece with. And that's happened. People have taken strains that, that I made and went and took and made a whole other thing in a direction that I had no knowledge of. And in no way does that diminish the work that I've done. And so many of us, whether it be your love of open source genetics, or really your love to see all of these different flavors make it to the next generation of strains, that pursuit and that willingness to share is something that, as genetics or as breeders, we should all really support.
And there's just, so many in the community that are like that, have that like mindset. And I think that's what makes us great and even better and growing as a community of growers. To that point, anybody you're looking at, anybody up and coming that we should be taking a look at? Anybody you're hyped on?
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't shout out Red Scare Seed Company.
Okay.
He's Nate's an old buddy. He's one of those people in the business that supported me very early on. Shout out to the Growcast. I know it's not
Yeah.
necessarily a breeder, but shout out to the Growcast and Jordan and everything that dude does for putting on growers and putting new up and coming people into the community. I'm a big sharer, man, and that's the kind of, when we go back to your buddy Hash Rookie, when we go back to some of these people that I hold in high regard within the community, it's often people who are willing to open the book and show you all the secrets. There's no cheat code. You have to do the hard work and you have to learn. But at the end of the day, if I can save somebody from making a mistake that I made, I will do that 100 times. I'll do it 100 times. And people who are willing to kind of open it up and say, there's so much snake oil. This is all the BS. This is really all the simple stuff you need, whether it be with hash production, whether it be cultivation. Like, those are breeders, growers, and hash makers that I support and have a ton of love for, are people who are willing to share, people who communicate with the community, and who are actually a part of that community. It's one thing to just be on the internet showing a ton of hash and sending people to your website to make money. But if people can't contact you and say, hey man, like I bought these seeds, like, can I get a pointer, or can you, kind of tell me why this didn't happen, or whatever it is, having that connection to the community, being willing to share and be a part of the community is really clutch. But a huge shout out to generally any of the small breeders at this point that are just doing it for love, that are just doing it for the passion, and they're just doing it to make sure their favorite strains make it on to the next generation.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. And that's what I like about being able to do show like this too, is to bring some of those smaller guys on and really sort of showcase what we're doing. And I've got somebody like that coming up on an episode very soon. Now, as much as I'd love to say, this is all the places you can find Terpfiend, what we can do is we can plug your Instagram, because that's one of the only spots that's safe for YouTube, that doesn't shut me down because they're dicks if I plug your actual
Oh, really?
website.
We can't plug websites at all?
If you have any sort of sales on there, YouTube will give me a strike on this video.
Okay,
Yeah, it's
no
absolutely
worries.
nuts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm easy to find, man. At Terpfiend, Terpfi3nd
Link down below.
underscore genetics on Instagram, and from there you can find all the rest of my social media podcasts. You can pretty much find me at any other point you need me.
Yeah, that's great. So Terp, any sort of last thoughts, things you're working on, something you want to plug or hype up here?
Yeah, man, if I could just reinforce that, if at any point, whether it's now or in the future, no matter who you are out there, whether you're a grower, whether you're a breeder, whether you're an extractor, whether you're just some guy that loves weed, if there's something out there that you feel like there's not enough of, be that thing and provide that thing. The more that you bring to the table, the more people are going to understand that it's valuable, whatever it is, whether it's a strain, whether it's a particular trait. Not everybody has your point of view. So what's important to you won't always be important to everybody else, but being that thing that you want to provide more of to the community is something we could all do and be able to contribute more for the future generations of people that are going to run our gear, that are going to grow our strains, that are going to be a part of the next cannabis community.
That is just fantastic advice, man. And I super appreciate your time and, coming on the show and just sharing your thoughts with us. So, guys, check out his Instagram down below. Go check out the rest of his stuff. Sir, appreciate you, man. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, man. I really appreciate it. That was a good one.
All right, and hope to talk again soon. Yeah. We out.